Welcome to LinguisticsTube. This episode is part of my series which explores the grammar of English. We will learn about all the major types of words, phrases, and clauses, as well as other interesting grammatical phenomena. Through these episodes, you will not only learn the theory of English grammar, but also practical tips and advice about how to improve your grammatical ability in English. In this episode, we will explore an interesting grammatical phenomenon called subject-verb agreement. In my opinion, the only way to introduce the topic of this episode is to begin with the statement that English grammar is difficult. I have no doubt that many of you will agree with me. It is certainly more difficult than the grammar of Chinese, for example. But what may be less clear to you is the reason for the difficult nature of English grammar. Let me spend the introduction outlining a few possible reasons for this. Your response to my opening statement might have been, "That's true, but other languages have more difficult grammar than English." You were certainly correct if you thought this, because languages such as Icelandic, Norwegian, and Russian present many challenges to learners of English. However, these languages are difficult for a very different reason. While these languages have endless rules to remember, English has comparatively fewer rules. Instead, English grammar is difficult because its rules are very inconsistent. Let's have a look at some examples. Firstly, it is clear that, compared to the three languages I just mentioned, English has an inconsistent pronoun system, with several gaps. One example of a gap is you. Specifically, this second-person pronoun doesn't have a plural form or an object form. However, compare this to the first and third-person pronouns, which all have plural and object forms. Specifically, I has we and me, and he or she has they and him or her. While there is a trend towards using you both and you all as the plural forms, these are not yet a compulsory grammatical rule. And there has never been a movement to create an object form of you. Thus, this is an obvious gap in the English pronoun system. The next example is regarding tense, specifically past tense. Most past tense verbs end with ed. For example, walked and wanted. However, there are two major exceptions to this. Firstly, for some past tense verbs, the vowel is changed inside the verb, such as I run today, but I ran yesterday. This is the same for swim, swam, and drink, drank. The second exception is that other verbs don't change their form at all, such as I hit him yesterday. He fit the cupboard in the kitchen last week. We do not say hitted or fitted. Thus, there are inconsistencies with regards to the past tense form of verbs. Thirdly, there is not only one way to make plural nouns. While the most common method is undoubtedly to add s at the end of the word, such as dog, dogs, there are other common methods too, which a learner of English must grapple with. For example, run can be added to the end of nouns, such as child, children. The vowel can be changed inside the noun, such as man, men, foot, feet. The entire noun can be changed, such as person, people. There can be no change to the noun. For example, 1 sheep, 2 sheep, 1 fish, 2 fish. And finally, there are unique plural forms for words taken from Latin, such as I and a, like in cactus, cacti, and agendum, agenda. Non-native speakers need to learn all of these exceptions individually. Going back to the languages I mentioned earlier, even though it's true that Icelandic, Norwegian, and Russian have many more grammatical rules than English, those rules are always consistent and regular. Therefore, you can be confident that, as a learner of Norwegian, all the rules you learn will always be the case for every language example of that rule. It is this reason that makes English grammar extremely difficult. If it had more inconsistencies, it would arguably be far easier for learners to achieve a high level of English grammar. We can conclude then that some aspects of English grammar are unnecessarily and unfairly confusing. The topic of today's episode is another example of an inconsistent grammatical rule, and it is called agreement. Agreement is quite a broad category, thus there are many different forms of it. In this episode, we will learn about just one form of agreement. It is called subject-verb agreement. However, this is quite a complicated form of agreement, so I would like to introduce agreement by showing you one of the other forms. It is the agreement between determiners and nouns. Determiners are a grammatical category, just like nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and prepositions. They are always before a noun and introduce it by determining what kind of noun it is. Here are 2 examples of determiner-noun agreement. This book, these books. Much money, many friends. In the first example, when the noun changes its form from singular to plural, the determiner also changes from singular to plural. And in the second example, the form of the noun changes from uncountable to countable and plural. Thus, from these 2 examples, you can see that there is agreement between the determiner and noun, because when the noun changes, the determiner is also forced to change. Therefore, their forms must always agree with each other. You might be asking, what is the reason for agreement? Unfortunately, there is no meaningful reason for it. In other words, no meaning is added through the change of the determiner's form. Thus, we still understand the phrase if we say, this books, because this and these are equivalent in terms of function, but they are different in terms of form. Therefore, we can conclude that there is no meaningful reason for agreement. Perhaps the only advantage is that it prepares the listener that the following noun will either be singular or plural. But this books is still perfectly understandable. This is because the noun is, logically, where the plural should be, because there is more than one book. This is not a noun, so it seems strange to pluralize it. We can support our claim that agreement is meaningless by looking at other languages with simpler grammar and almost no agreement, such as Chinese. I say almost because Chinese does use the word xie for plural determiners, such as 这些书, which means these books. Nevertheless, Chinese has far less agreement than English, And the type that we will learn about in this episode is definitely the most widespread form of agreement in English. So let's learn about it. Let's now define the type of agreement that we will learn about in this episode. In subject-verb agreement, the subject and the verb must agree with each other. Specifically, the verb must agree with two aspects of the subject: its number and person. Allow me to briefly define these concepts. Number is the difference between singular and plural. For example, this is the difference between I and we. Next is person, which expresses the relationship between the speaker and whom the speaker is talking about. There are three persons. First person is I, we. Second person is you. And third person is he, she, it, they. You might be thinking, what about us, him, her, them? Well, these are object pronouns, and there is no agreement between the verb and the object in English. So we can ignore those pronouns in this situation. Overall, then, subject-verb agreement means that when the number and/or the person of the subject changes, the verb must also change in order to match it. Here are two questions that I would like you to think about. Firstly, which English verb has the most forms? And secondly, what are the forms? Please pause the video now to answer these questions. The verb is to be, and it has 8 forms: am, are, is, was, were, will be, being, been. Here is another question for you. What subjects are used with the first 5 verb forms? In this case, by subject, I am referring specifically to personal pronouns. Please pause the video now. I is used with am. We, you, and they are used with are. He, she, it are used with is. I, he, she, it are used with was. And we, you, they are used with were. Here is a final question. What is the number and person of these subjects? Please pause the video now. I is first person singular. We is first person plural. You can be both second person singular and second person plural. He, she, it are third person singular, and they is third person plural. We now have a full understanding of the various forms of subjects, so let's continue. Back to subject-verb agreement, we just learned that be has the most verb forms in English. However, thankfully, the vast majority of English verbs do not have this many forms. Thus, we will focus on a specific type of subject-verb agreement in this video, which is the most common type. It is called third-person singular verb agreement, and it occurs on almost all verbs. Here is a simple example, which uses a real noun instead of a personal pronoun. The dogs chase the cat, and the dog chases the cat. The first example's subject is third person plural, whereas the second example subject is third person singular. We can easily see the number change here, but what is less obvious is the person of this noun. So, in case you don't know, all nouns, except pronouns, are always third person. Let's now explain the phenomenon we saw in the two examples on the previous screen. If the subject is singular and third person, the main verb adds s. If the subject is plural, there is no s, even if the subject is third person. This is because the verb must agree with both the number and the person. If only one of these is satisfied, then there is no agreement. Additionally, there is another factor that constrains the third person singular verb agreement, and that is tense. This form of agreement only happens if the main verb is present tense. If the verb is past tense or future tense, then no s is added. Notice that I specifically said main verb. You will see the reason for this and a definition of main verb soon. So, in conclusion, the complete rule for this form of agreement is the verb adds s when the verb is present tense and when the subject is third person and singular. If it helps, then you can remember it like this. A singular noun removes s, and the verb agrees with it by adding s. We can call this a singular verb. However, a plural noun adds s, and the verb agrees with it by removing s. We can call this a plural verb. So, nouns and verbs form plural in opposite ways. You can see this in the same two examples. In the sentence, the dogs chased the cat, the plural noun adds s, whereas the plural verb removes s. However, in the sentence, the dog chases the cat, the singular noun removes the s, whereas the singular verb adds s. Let's explore the situation for pronoun subjects in more detail, now that we have talked about the general situation for all other types of noun. In a nutshell, the exact same rule applies for pronouns as well as normal nouns. Therefore, third-person singular personal pronouns also trigger verb agreement when the verb is present tense. For example, the English third-person singular pronouns are he, she, it. So we add s to the verb in the sentence, she chases the cat. However, analogous to the dogs on the previous screen, the third-person plural pronoun they does not trigger this type of verb agreement because it is not singular. Therefore, we say they chase the cat. So that deals with the question of number, but what about person? Only third-person pronouns trigger verb agreement, so first and second person personal pronouns do not. We can see this in the examples I chase the cat, we chase the cat, and you chase the cat. Regardless of number, none of these pronouns agree with the verb by adding s. Let's now look at another aspect of subject-verb agreement. And to do this, we need to discuss the grammar of English verbs in more detail. As you have learned before, it is common for a sentence to have two verbs. You can see this by comparing the following two sentences. The girls talk to me, and The girls have talked to me. Both sentences have a main verb. In the second sentence, the second verb, talked, is the main verb. Therefore, what type of verb is the first verb in the second sentence? Have. It is an auxiliary verb. So, what is the difference between these two types of verb? The main verb contains the meaning, whereas the auxiliary verb adds extra information about the time that the action in the main verb happened. Let's explore auxiliary verbs in more detail. Here is a question for you. In addition to has, have, what are the three other auxiliary verbs in English that can be affected by third-person singular verb agreement? Pause the video to work out the answer. They are is, are, was, were, does, do. Now for the rule regarding verb agreement. If the number of the subject changes, then the auxiliary verb can change. In this case, I am only thinking about real nouns, not pronouns. Therefore, regarding all real nouns which are third-person plural subjects use the auxiliary verbs are, were, have, do. For example, the girls have talked to me. However, third-person singular subjects use the auxiliary verbs is, was, has, does. For example, the girl has talked to me. Therefore, auxiliary verbs do not add s, unlike most other English verbs. And also, the main verb is not affected. So far, I have only shown you example sentences for the auxiliary verbs has, have. Using the three other auxiliary verbs is, are, was, were, does, do, please pause the video and make similar examples to the girls have talked to me and the girl has talked to me. For example, the girls are talking to me and the girl is talking to me. The girls were talking to me. The girl was talking to me. The girls do talk to me. The girl does talk to me. Other auxiliary verbs, like did, do not have other forms depending on the number and person of the subject. This, again, highlights the inconsistency of English grammar, because was, were are the past tense forms of is, are, and they both have different agreement forms. But did is the past tense form of does, do, and it does not have different forms. Regarding the auxiliary verbs we just saw, it is worth remembering that they can also be main verbs. You can see this by comparing the following sentences. The girl has talked to me. The girl has a dog. The girl is talking to me. The girl is nice. The girl was talking to me. The girl was nice. The girl does talk to me. The girl does drugs. Regardless of whether these verbs are main or auxiliary, they are still affected by third-person singular verb agreement in the same way. So, it is important to understand the function of the verb in the sentence in order to decide whether it is main or auxiliary and apply the verb agreement correctly. This is especially important because, even as a main verb, these four verbs do not add s, unlike other main verbs. They instead change their form. They are also the only verbs to change their form for agreement when they are past tense. All other past tense verbs are not affected by subject-verb agreement. There is one more aspect to the situation of auxiliary verbs and verb agreement. While we have seen so far that auxiliary verbs always change their form, there is one situation in which they do not. For this to happen, there must be 3 verbs in the sentence. The third verb is the main verb, has or have is the second verb, and it functions as an auxiliary verb, and the first verb is a modal verb. Before we look at some examples with 3 verbs, remember that the auxiliary verb changes its form in a sentence with 2 verbs. For instance, the girl has talked to me, the girls have talked to me. The change here is from has to have, when the subject changes from singular to plural. But in a sentence with a modal verb, the auxiliary does not change. Look at these examples. The girl could have talked to me. The girls could have talked to me. If the first sentence omitted the modal verb, have would change to has. But because of the modal, there is no change. You can see this in the third sentence on the screen. The change to the auxiliary verb, which would usually happen, sounds very strange and is clearly ungrammatical if there is a modal in the sentence. The girl could has talked to me. Notice that I've only talked about has, have in this section. That's because the other 3 auxiliary verbs cannot be after a modal verb. For the rest of this episode, we will discuss different situations involving the subject of the sentence, because these situations can affect subject-verb agreement in different ways. The first situation we will discuss is about a type of subject called a compound subject. This type of subject contains 2 nouns, which are separated by and or. These are called conjunctions, and these 2 conjunctions can affect verb agreement in different ways. Let's start with and compound subjects. These are always plural. This is true even if the 2 nouns inside the subject are singular. You can see this in the first example on the screen. The boy and the girl chase the cat. Therefore, if the 2 nouns are joined by and, then we can conclude that a singular noun plus a singular noun equals a plural subject. In other words, if there were only one singular noun, the verb would add s. But if there are 2 singular nouns, the subject becomes plural and there is no s. However, compound subjects with or are not always plural. Instead, the verb agrees with the closest noun to the verb, which is the second noun in the subject. For example, my mum or my dad brings me dessert every day. Here, the verb has third-person singular verb agreement because the verb agrees with my dad, as it is the closest noun to the verb. Therefore, if we say, my mum or my friends bring me dessert every day, now the verb does not have verb agreement, because it agrees with the plural noun, friends. The next situation we'll discuss is when there is a phrase or clause between the subject and the verb. In this situation, the phrase or clause does not affect the number of the subject, so it does not trigger verb agreement. Let's start with phrases. It is very common for prepositional phrases to be between the subject and the verb. There is an episode in this English grammar series about prepositional phrases, so you can learn about them in detail in that video. Basically, a prepositional phrase contains firstly a preposition and secondly a noun. Here is a simple example. The boy with the girl chases the cat. The subject is the boy, and the prepositional phrase is with the girl. Therefore, the verb has third-person singular verb agreement because the subject is singular. The verb also has third-person singular verb agreement if the noun inside the prepositional phrase is plural, because it is not the subject of the sentence. For example, the boy with the girls chases the cat. In contrast, if the subject is plural, as in, the boys with the girl chase the cat, the verb no longer adds s. This is also true for clauses that are connected to the subject, such as relative clauses. There is also an episode in this English grammar series about relative clauses, so you can learn about them in detail in that video. But for now, a simple example of a sentence with a relative clause is, the women who went to the meeting were bored. In this sentence, the main clause is the women were bored, because this makes sense on its own. The relative clause is who went to the meeting. It functions like an adjective, because it adds more detail about the noun, the women. In this sentence, the verb were agrees with the subject women, which is plural, not with the noun phrase in the relative clause, the meeting, which is singular. The next situation that we'll discuss is when the subject is a collective noun. This is a singular noun which refers to a group of people, animals, or things. It can be used with either a singular or a plural verb. Or, in other words, sometimes the verb adds s, and sometimes it doesn't. Whether or not this happens depends on the meaning of the noun. Unfortunately, there is not always a clear-cut difference between whether the meaning expresses singularity or plurality, so you need to use your common sense and judgment. In general, if the meaning of the noun refers to the group as a whole, and therefore perceives it as a single unit, the noun is singular, and therefore the verb triggers third-person singular verb agreement. Here are two examples. Firstly, the team is meeting today. The inherent meaning of a team is one group of many people. So while there are many people inside the team, it still perceives the group as a singular unit. Here is another example. The jury has decided that she is innocent. A jury is a group of people, but here they are one unit, making the decision together. In contrast, if the inherent meaning of the noun refers more to the individuals within the group than the group as a singular whole, then the noun is plural and thus does not trigger verb agreement. For example, the couple are getting married today. This collective noun does mean one pair, but the meaning of the noun focuses more on the two individuals inside the group, making it plural. And here is a second example. The jury have been arguing for several days. The collective noun jury now does not trigger third-person singular verb agreement, and therefore we think of the jury as a plural noun, because this sentence focuses on the individual members of the jury who are arguing with each other. Therefore, here, the noun certainly refers to the individuals within the group. The next complicated type of subject is a noun whose form looks plural, but could have a singular meaning or a plural meaning. Thus, the form appears plural, but the function is either singular or plural. These are usually nouns which end in s, which is the most common way to form plural. We can divide them into three groups. Firstly, there are subjects which have a plural form, but a singular meaning. These always have a singular verb, so there is third-person singular verb agreement. Some common examples include news, measles, mumps, mathematics, linguistics. It is common to hear some non-native speakers treating these words as plural, and thus not using any verb agreement, or instead removing the s from these words in order to use them in a singular way. Thus, you must pay attention to these kinds of subjects. Here are some examples. The news is interesting today. I occasionally hear my students say, "The news are interesting today." The mumps lasts for 2 weeks. I occasionally hear, "The mumps last for 2 weeks." Mathematics is my favorite subject. Linguistics has been my favorite subject. I occasionally hear my students say, "Mathematics are my favorite subject," and "Linguistics have been my favorite subject." The second group is subjects with a plural form, but either a singular or plural meaning. Therefore, the meaning of the subject determines whether or not third-person singular verb agreement is triggered. Some common examples are words which are areas of study and also have additional meanings. For example, politics, economics. So, you could say, economics is a very important area of study, because it is one area of study. And you could say, the economics of the project are very strong, which means that the project has a lot of money. It is plural because there are many aspects of the finances of the project. Finally, there are subjects whose form is plural and also require a plural verb. Two common examples are scissors and trousers, as in, the scissors are in the drawer, and your trousers are on the bed. However, if we say these sentences as, the pair of scissors are in the drawer, and your pair of trousers is on the bed, then the subject becomes pair, which is singular, and of scissors becomes a prepositional phrase. Therefore, it now requires a singular verb. Next, there are several books, films, countries, and so on, whose name is plural. However, because it is one entity, it always requires a singular verb. Here are a few examples. The Grapes of Wrath, The Three Musketeers, Ghostbusters, The Maldives. The first two are novels, the third is a film, and the fourth is a country. Here they are within sentences. They all trigger third-person singular verb agreement. The Grapes of Wrath requires deep knowledge of American history. The Three Musketeers is my least favourite novel. Ghostbusters is one of the most popular comedy films of all time. The Maldives is an archipelago in the Indian Ocean. The next situation that we must be careful of when deciding the correct verb agreement is sentences which are not subject-verb-object, but sentences which have a subject complement after the verb. A subject complement is a word which describes the subject of the sentence. Usually, the subject and the subject complement both refer to the same entity. Here are some simple examples of sentences with subject complements. Ben is a policeman. Tom was a ghost. The grammar of these sentences is easy because, for example, Ben is singular and a policeman is singular. However, the grammar becomes more difficult when the number of the subject and subject complement are different. Look at this example. My favourite animal is dogs. We could rephrase it as, dogs are my favourite animal. The meaning is the same, but the agreement is different. The rule is simple. The verb always agrees with the subject. In the first example, the subject is singular, so the verb is singular. Finally, is the situation of indefinite pronouns, which is another type of complicated subject. This type of pronoun refers to non-specific beings, objects, or places. You can see many examples of them on this screen and the next screen. Some of these are singular, whereas others are plural. You will need to use your judgment and common sense to decide the number of each indefinite pronoun. They are all, of course, third person, so all the singular ones can trigger verb agreement. The singular ones include either, another, anyone, somebody, everyone, nobody, nothing, every. Here are a few example sentences. Everybody has gone home. Nothing makes sense. Another is coming here. As you can see, these singular indefinite pronouns trigger third-person singular verb agreement. If you are still unsure about whether the indefinite pronoun is singular, then one method is to put person after the indefinite pronoun and see whether the verb agreement makes sense. This is because person is singular. For example, if you are not sure whether to say neither is coming here or neither are coming here, then put person afterwards. Neither person is coming here sounds grammatical, so we can conclude that it is a singular indefinite pronoun. Here is one more example. Every man, woman, and child needs to leave the building. This looks like a typical and compound subject, which should be plural. However, here is a new rule. If the subject contains every, then it is always singular. So, even though compound subjects are plural, this subject is singular because this subject could be replaced with everyone, and everyone is a singular indefinite pronoun. Therefore, because we would say everyone needs, we also use needs in this sentence. In contrast, these indefinite pronouns are plural, both, few, fewer, many, several, others. Again, if you are not sure about its number, then put people afterwards. This word is plural, so if it sounds grammatical, then the indefinite pronoun is plural. For example, many have attended the party can be many people have attended the party. A few are not coming can be a few people are not coming. And several tell me that they will be late can be several people tell me that they will be late. As you can see, these plural indefinite pronouns do not trigger third-person singular verb agreement. And finally, some indefinite pronouns can be both singular and plural. These are all, any, more, most, none, some. There is a simple rule as to whether the subject triggers verb agreement or not. There is no third-person singular verb agreement if the noun connected to the pronoun is a non-count noun, and there is verb agreement if the noun is the opposite, a count noun. A count noun can be counted using numbers. For example, dog, horse, shop. However, a non-count noun cannot, such as sugar, water, air. Here are some examples. All of the table is dirty. All of them are experts. Any information is helpful. Are there any ladies in the audience? More evidence is better. More people were ignored. Most of the meat was rotten. Most of the people agree with me. None of his knowledge is useful. None of his friends come. Some of the sugar is on the table. Some of the balls are on the table. For the rest of this episode, we will do 5 activities. In each activity, you will see several sentences. In each one, the verb is in brackets. Pause the video and choose the correct form of the verb. After that, I will show you the answers. I should say that there are some new rules in these examples that I didn't explain in the video. So, try to work out the rule in order to answer the question, or try to work it out after you see the answer. Let's go. Your brother John have come to see you. Your brother and John have come to see you. The senator and the delegate want to make an announcement. Every man and every woman have to do something for the country. Every dog and every cat have to play together. Okay, please pause the video. And here are the answers. The first sentence is has, because the subject means your brother whose name is John. However, in the second sentence, there are 2 people, so it is a compound subject. This is also true for the third sentence. Regarding the fourth sentence, remember that if the subject contains every, then it is always singular. Thus, even though it looks like a typical plural compound subject, this subject could be replaced with everyone. Therefore, because we would say everyone has, we also use has in this sentence. This is the same for the fifth example, because you could change the subject to every animal, which is singular. A cup and saucer be placed on the table. A cup and a dish be placed on the table. A brown and white dog be at your doorsteps. A brown and a white dog be fighting over a bone. Bread and butter be very tasty. Bread and butter have both risen in price. Oil and water do not mix. And here are the answers. The first sentence is singular because these two nouns are one collective object. However, the two nouns in the second sentence never appear together as one object. So this is a compound subject that is plural. The third and fourth sentences should be self-explanatory. The fifth sentence is singular because, like the first sentence, we perceive these two nouns in this context as being one collective object. In other words, when talking about these two items as food that we eat, we perceive them as one type of food. Thus, if you order bread and butter in a restaurant, it arrives as one completed item of food. However, the same nouns in the sixth sentence are plural because, in this case, we are discussing them as if we are buying them in a supermarket as two separate products. Finally, the seventh sentence is plural because these are two separate items. Thus, this is a typical compound subject. You want to borrow money from me? But I, like you, be broke. Everyone, except a few complete idiots, be able to see that. The eggs, not the hen, be stolen. Not only you, but also I, be at fault. Please pause the video. And here are the answers. In these, you need to ignore the inserted noun in the phrase between the commas. In this situation, the verb always agrees with the first noun, not the embedded phrase. The fourth sentence is a little different, however. Here, the overall meaning of the sentence is that the speaker is saying that he or she is at fault. Therefore, the verb needs to agree with the noun that is the primary subject of the sentence. Everybody be to report here tomorrow. Every student have several chapters to report on. Each have to make a 5-minute speech. Each of you be responsible for half of the job. Please pause the video. And here are the answers. These are all singular because they begin with singular indefinite pronouns. This is the rule even in a sentence like sentence 4, which seems like each of you are responsible for half of the job is correct. Nevertheless, in this case, the indefinite pronoun overrides the number of you. All of these be apples. All of the money have been spent. All but one of the apples be ripe. A lot of the apples be damaged. A lot of time have been wasted. Half of the apples still look good. Half of this apple be rotten. Some of the cost be for transportation. Okay. Please pause the video. And here are the answers. For the first three, remember that all can either be singular or plural, depending on the overall meaning of the sentence. The answers for the first two sentences are self-explanatory, but the third sentence is a little more tricky. You must be careful to realize that this sentence is talking about most of the apples. Thus, you must ignore one of the apples, which on its own would be singular, and focus only on all. Next, a lot of functions similarly to all, so you can use common sense to decide the answer. In sentence 6, half of the apples is still several apples, so it is treated as plural, but in sentence 7, only one apple is involved, so it is singular. And finally, some is singular because the noun inside the subject is singular. This is the end of the video about subject-verb agreement. If you liked what you heard, then you can find more videos in my English grammar series, as well as other series on the topics of English and linguistics. Thank you for watching.